Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Raj, for that nice introduction. I didn't realize that Raj had done the research to figure out what my middle name was, so I appreciate that. Thank you for getting that joke. So, as Raj mentioned, some of you know this. In a former life, I did work as a political speechwriter. It was a pretty searing experience, but I did learn something. I learned something about effective presentations. I've mentioned this to some of you before, so you already know this, but I discovered over the years, working in politics, working as a speechwriter, the key to an effective presentation, anywhere, anytime. It turns out there are three key elements to any effective presentation, anywhere, anytime. Doesn't matter whether the audience is large or small, doesn't matter what language you're speaking. Three key ingredients to any effective presentation, anywhere, anytime. They are brevity, levity, and repetition. Let me say that one more time, all right? Brevity, levity, and repetition. So I'm going to be brief. I'm not going to be too severe and serious about it all, and I will repeat the important stuff over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until you want to scream. I'm excited to be here because I just finished a new book, and they've let me out of my office, and you're, I think, the second people I've even mentioned this to in public. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what I found. The book is called When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. It's not out for about 90 days, but I want to give you a tantalizing sneak preview of some of what's in there. And to Raj's point, I think it's true for all of us when we create businesses or we create books or pieces of art. At some level, we're looking to solve problems for ourselves. We're looking to find answers for ourselves. And this book is very much like that. I realized that I was making all kinds of when decisions, all right, all kinds of timing decisions. When in the day should I work out? When in the day should I do certain kinds of heads-down work? When in the day should I do certain kinds of creative work? Even like, when should I go to the doctor? When should I avoid going to the doctor? Why do beginnings matter? What do I do at the midpoint of a project? How do I know when to abandon something that isn't working or when to keep pushing forward on it? How do I coordinate with people in time? So all of these when questions that I was asking myself, and I started looking for the answers to it, and I realized that there weren't really many answers. I was truly just looking for a book that would answer these questions. It didn't exist, so I said, oh, fuck, I got to write it. So, sorry about that. I'm just being authentic here. And so, but it was a fascinating experience. What I found out at a very top level was this. We tend to think that timing is an art, but timing is really a science. There's this incredible body of research across dozens of fields: economics, anthropology, endocrinology, anesthesiology, cognitive science, just a whole range of research out there that allows us to make systematically better decisions about when to do stuff. And I'm convinced, after 2 years of research, that we make timing decisions based on intuition and instinct, but we ought to be making them based on the evidence. Because the evidence is out there. There's some really, really fascinating stuff. Among them, among sort of the tips you can glean from this are, one, seriously, if you can avoid it, never go to the hospital in the afternoon. What happens at hospitals in afternoons is terrifying. You have hand-washing compliance goes down in afternoons. Anesthesia errors, 3 times more likely at 3 in the afternoon than at 9 in the morning. Doctors, 20% more likely to prescribe unnecessary antibiotics. Colonoscopies, endoscopists, because we want to talk about colonoscopies at 9 o'clock in the morning. Endoscopists find half as many polyps in the afternoon as they do in the morning for the same kind of population. All kinds of stuff about synchronizing in time. There's some really amazing research on choral singing, of all things. We're talking here a lot about meaning and purpose. Choral singing ends up being one of the best things you can do for your body and mind. But I want to talk about one aspect of timing here, to give you a slice of it, and that has to do with endings. Okay, I want to talk about endings. I studied beginnings, I studied midpoints, I studied endings, and I want to tell you basically what the science of endings tells us. And it tells us some things that I think are incredibly germane to what conscious capitalism is all about. So here's what endings do. All right, they do 4 things for us. I'm going to go through the science of them. 1, endings help us energize. 2, endings help us encode. 3, endings help us edit. 4, endings help us elevate. Okay, that's what endings do. They help us energize, encode, edit, and elevate. And it only took me 7 months to get them all to start with E. So let's start here. And what I want to do here is I want to actually ask you guys a bunch of questions. I want to read you a couple stories. So I want you to think about this. Because what happens is that if we start thinking about when, with the same rigor we think about what and why and how, the world becomes more interesting, but you can also be more effective. So let me ask you a question here. So how many of you have ever run a marathon? I bet there are a lot of people here. Wow, that's incredible, okay? So there are about 1,100 marathons each year in the United States. And in a typical marathon, amazingly enough, about 50% of runners are running for the first time. 50% of people in marathons today are first-time runners. Okay, so here's a when question that I want you to think about. When, that is, at what age, do you think are people most likely to run their first marathon? When are you most likely to run your first marathon? At what age? 35, 40, 43? Okay, prime number. Sorry. I'm revealing a little too much about my deficiencies here. Let me just tell you the answer. Here's the age at which people are most likely to run a marathon. Age 29. Interesting. Let's take a look at this chart here. I got charts. Let's take a look at this chart. All right, these are the ages of running marathons at various, this is the percentage of first-time marathoners. Take a look at 29, all right? You are twice as likely to run a marathon at age 29 as you are at age 28. You are twice as likely to run a marathon at age 29 as you are at age 30. Now, do we have any physicians here by any chance? Any physicians here? Okay, so there's a physician sitting right there. I'm not a physician, but are there massive physiological differences between a 28-year-old and a 29-year-old? In general, probably not, right? Not on average, no. Are there massive physiological differences between someone who's 29 and someone who's 30? Probably not. This is peculiar. Guess when else people are likely to run a marathon? 39. Thank you, age 39. Here's a hard one. Guess when else people are likely to run a marathon? Let's take a look at this. Age 49, people are 3 times more likely to run a marathon at age 49 as they are at age 50. All right, so I'm an Ohioan, so in Ohio we sometimes say things like, what the Sam Hill is going on? Here's what's going on. It's our first thing. Endings help us energize. Endings help us energize. This is one of the first principles of ending. This is an enduring principle in behavioral science, actually for a very, very, very long time. Endings help us energize. When we see the end, when we anticipate the end, we often, not always, kick a little harder. And so what's happening is that there's no physiological, rational reason for running a marathon at age 29, but people feel, oh my gosh, I'm hitting the end of something. I got to do something, and they're energized. As I said, this is a very sturdy idea in the world of behavioral science. There's a fellow named Clark Hull. Many of you, if you took psych back in college, you learned about the behaviorists, right, who had this notion of human beings as operating not much different from rats in a maze. And the world of behavioral science, thanks to people like Martin Seligman, who got a name check earlier, has expanded our notions, expanded the dimension of understanding of human behavior, but we are sometimes like rats. And so what Hull found, he put these rats down little raceways, like rat raceways, and he measured the increments, how fast they were running, and what he found is the closer they got to the food at the finish line, the faster they ran. So they ran, a little faster, 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 the whiff of cheese, faster. And that's one of the effects that endings have on it, that endings have on us. That when we get closer to the end, when we anticipate the end, we kick a little harder. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is where we can take this notion of human beings as rats and move it much more into the world of humanistic psychology, of Maslow and Seligman, and even into the emerging world of behavioral economics and Thaler and all those guys, is this. One of the things that happens at the end of almost anything is what you saw with the marathon runners. Here's how the researchers say it. Because the approach of a new decade functions as a marker of progress through the lifespan, people are more apt to evaluate their lives as a chronological decade ends than they are at any other time. I want to give you one more mundane example before I pay it off with the search for meaning, just to read you the stage directions here. But this is interesting. I want to give you a mundane example. I do want to give you a mundane example because this is actually very germane in the tactical world of business. Some very interesting research on this. You give two groups of people a gift certificate. Okay, so I give two groups of people a gift certificate. Okay, you get the same value of gift certificate. I give you 2 weeks to cash in the gift certificate. I give you 2 months to cash in the gift certificate. Who's more likely to cash it in? 2 weeks by 3x. Now that's crazy, right? These people have four times the time, right? These people have 4 times the time. It makes no sense. There's another thing on organ donation. You give one group a finite amount of time, say a month, to sign up to be organ donors. You give this group no deadline at all. This group, more likely to sign up to be organ donors, even though it makes no sense because this group has forever. And this group still signs up more. All right, that's what endings do. But in particular, as I was saying before, what endings do more than anything, and this is important to understand in your business and your customer experiences, is this, that they call these folks, the 29-year-olds, 39-year-olds, 49-year-olds, 9-enders, is that 9-enders are particularly preoccupied with aging and meaningfulness, which is linked to the rise in behavior that suggests a search for or crisis of meaning. One of the things that endings energize us to do is seek meaning. And you're going to see this common thread through all of this that ends up being really fascinating on a personal level and on a business level. Let's go to the next one. Endings help us encode. Endings help us encode. So here I want to read you a few stories, and I want to ask you to make an evaluation here. So I want to tell you the story of this story here. It's a story that you probably know reasonably well, and it's this. So on February 8th, 1931, Mildred Marie Wilson of Marion, Indiana, gave birth to what would be her only child, a baby boy that she and her husband named James, but called Jimmy. So here's Jimmy's childhood, happy but tumultuous. He moves from northern Indiana to southern California. Then he has a family tragedy. He moves back to northern Indiana from southern California. And he leads this very happy, kind of traditional Midwestern kind of life of debate teams and church groups and very happy, ordinary, middle-class American life. He graduates from high school. He goes back to Southern California from college. And in 1951, just shy of age 20, he drops out of UCLA to pursue an acting career. Then it gets interesting. He quickly landed a few commercials and minor television roles. In the year he turned 23, one of the era's most famous directors cast him in a film adaptation of a John Steinbeck novel. The movie became a hit. He was nominated for an Oscar. That same year, he landed another role in an even more prominent movie. It earned him another Oscar nomination. And in a blink, at an impossibly young age, he became an impossibly huge Hollywood star. Then, about 4 months shy of his 25th birthday, he got killed in a car accident. Okay, so I think we had some people. So this is James Dean, the story of James Dean. Okay, so here's a question that social psychologists have asked people. I'm going to ask it to you as well. Taking Jimmy, as he was known, taking his life as a whole, how desirable do you think it was? Use a 1 to 9 scale, with 1 being the most undesirable and 9 being the most desirable. So write down what number you have. Okay? How desirable was this life? Now, I'm going to ask you another question. I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Here's the hypothetical. Imagine Jimmy had lived a few more decades, but that he never achieved the professional success of his early 20s. He didn't spiral into homelessness or drug addiction. His career didn't implode. His stardom just declined from its celestial heights. Maybe he did a sitcom or two and won a few smaller parts in less successful movies before he died, say, in his mid-50s. Okay, so think about that alternative, Jimmy. What's your number there? Okay, what's your number on a 1 to 9 scale? How desirable was that life? Now, does anybody in here have put down a higher number for Jimmy 1 than for Jimmy 2? Okay, you know what? Most people do that. And you know what? That's freaking weird. Think about it. In the second scenario, he lives 30 years longer. he lives 30 years longer, and it's not a miserable life, it's a perfectly lovely life. But over and over again, when people evaluate those kinds of things, they have this peculiar reaction. A life that goes like this is actually, even if it's shorter, is seen as less desirable than a life that goes like this, even if it's longer. The suggestion, here are the researchers, the suggestion that adding mildly pleasant years to a very positive life does not enhance but decreases perceptions of the quality of life is counterintuitive. We label this the James Dean effect, because a life that is short but intensely exciting, such as a storied life led by actor James Dean, is seen as positive. Okay? This is the point about endings. Endings help us encode. What do I mean by encode? What I mean by encode is they help us evaluate and record. Evaluate and record. So what we do, we look at Jimmy's life at the end, we evaluate it, lock it into our memory. This is a big deal in business. This is a big deal in business. I'll give you one example of this. Yelp. If you're bored right now, go ahead and do this. If you're bored, look on Yelp and just randomly pick a restaurant that you go to that you like on Yelp and go through the actual written reviews and take a look at how many of those reviews describe what happened at the end of the entire meal, if not the entire evening. Look at how many people evaluate and record their impression on Yelp because I lost my keys and they found them and called me and I came back and they were still there. I love this place. I got an unexpected dessert. I love this place at the very end. They messed up the bill and I had to wait longer. I hate this place. Oh, that's what endings help us do. And this gets a little bit weird. Let me give you another example of this. I'm going to read you a couple more stories, okay? This is very kind of, we have a conscious capitalist, well, I'm not going to say anymore. Here we go. Here's another study out of Yale. I'm going to tell you about another fellow named Jim, all right? I put this lengthy story on the board here so you can take a look at it, but here's Jim's story. Jim inherited his father's company 30 years ago. As CEO of his company, Jim often made decisions that put his own financial interests before the well-being of his employees. He paid his employees far less than employees at competitor companies. He never gave his employees bonuses, and he often denied them healthcare benefits. Moreover, Jim never donated any money to charity. Last year, however, Jim had a change of heart, and he vowed to drastically change his behavior. Shortly after, he became very generous and altruistic. He raised his employees' salaries, gave them large bonuses, and improved their health care coverage. He also started donating large amounts of money to various charities around the community. But only 1 year later, Jim suffered a massive heart attack and died instantly. So the question they want people to ask is pretty much the same one. What kind of person should be Jim? That's a little bit different. What kind of person should Jim be remembered as? Okay, the same 1 to 9 scale, but I want you to say, measure his level of morality. 1, the least moral, 9, the most moral. Think about that for a second. Now, let me give you an alternative Jim. Jim inherited his father's company 30 years ago. As CEO of his company, Jim often made decisions that put the well-being of his employees before his own financial interests. He paid his employees far more than employees at other companies. He gave his employees large bonuses and generous healthcare benefits. Moreover, Jim frequently donated large amounts of money to various charities around the community. Last year, however, Jim had a change of heart, and he vowed to drastically change his behavior. Shortly after, he became very selfish and greedy. He lowered employees' salaries, stopped giving them bonuses, and routinely denied his employees health care coverage. He also stopped donating any money to charity. But only 1 year later, Jim suffered a massive heart attack and died instantly. Now, same question. What kind of person should Jim be remembered as? 1 to 9 scale of morality. Now, what's interesting about this research here is that people evaluate these two Jims on their morality pretty much the same. Actually, Jim number 1 is a little bit higher. But think about that for a second. Just think about that for a second. Jim number 1 was a jerk for 29 years and a conscious capitalist for 1. Jim number 2 was a conscious capitalist for 29 years and a jerk for 1. So in mathematical terms, we know who the better Jim is, don't we? And yet, when people evaluate the morality of these 2 men, Jim 1 comes out a little bit higher because people record and evaluate and record what happens at the end, because endings help us encode. So this is in some ways an opportunity and a warning sign, because what happens at the end is often how people remember. This is Daniel Kahneman figured this out 30 years, like everything else, 40 years ago. They neglect duration and focus too much on the end. This is an opportunity and a warning. People are willing to override a relatively short period of one kind of behavior with a relatively short period of another kind just because it occurred at the end of life. Number 3, endings help us edit. Let's talk about life, because this is all morning we've been talking about life, and we can see life, as a writer, I see life in some ways as a 3-act drama, right? Our lives are a 3-act drama, okay? So you got act 1. The hopeful beginning, okay? You grow up, you try to, you leave the nest, you're full of optimism and hope, and you go off to make your way in the world. Act 2, harsh reality descends, right? You try to make a living, you scramble to maybe find a mate, maybe have some kids, you suffer setbacks, triumphs, you move a little forward, you get stymied a little bit. It's tumultuous, Act 2. All right, Act 3, the denouement, all right? Maybe you've accomplished something, maybe you have people who love you, but it's pretty clear in Act 3 that this is the last act and the curtain is going to fall, okay? So think about life in those 3-act terms. Now, think about this question right here. What happens to the side, this is some amazing, they just announced the MacArthur's this morning. 53rd year in a row I was denied. But this woman who I'm about to mention deserves a MacArthur. Her name is Laura Carstensen at Stanford. She's done some incredible research on the psychology, sociology, even economics of aging. And this is some of her research, and it's this. What do you think happens to the size of people's friend networks, the size of their networks of friends, their social networks, not the digital social networks, but their actual real flesh and blood social networks over time, from Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3. What do you think, I'm not joking, what do you think it would look like if you were to draw the chart? Bell curve. So it sort of looks like, so this is Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So it sort of looks like this. Okay, tell me if that's, Eric, very good guess, Eric. Here's what it looks like. All right, what you have is it's not quite a bell curve, but the trajectory, you're very close on the trajectory. What you have is Act 1, wow, I'm making all these friends. Act 2, I'm making even more friends. I have this incredible network. Act 3, whew, big decline. Look at the slope there. So this reaffirms what we know. It's like old age can be sad. Old age, Act 3 can be an age full of pathos. That Act 3, when we get to the end, we retire, we lose social connections, our kids leave, our friends start passing away. That Act 3 can be a very sad story. That's what we think. Act 3 is a sad story. But that's not a true story. There's something more important happening here that is fascinating. What Carstensen and some of her colleagues did was this. They had people evaluate, they said, break up your social network or divide up your social network. Tell me who's the inner circle, the people you can't live without. Tell me about the next level out, the people who are really important to you, but they're not as important as the inner circle. Now tell me about the outer circle. Look at what happens here on this other chart. People's outer circle declines significantly, but the size of their inner circle stays the same. In some ways, it's even larger. This is what happens in Act 3 of our lives. All right? It's not a sad story. It's a happy story. In this play, we've got Act 1, Act 2. You got all these other characters in this play besides you, right? You got your friends and your family, and they're moving through, and all these characters are coming on stage. And then in Act 3, where do they go? Where do they go? Do they just kind of quietly creep off stage? No, say these researchers. What happens to those other characters? As these researchers put it, they were actively eliminated. They were actively eliminated. When we get to Act 3 of our lives, Laura Carstensen and others have found, we edit our friends. We edit our friends. Why do we do that? Once again, so much of this comes back to the search for meaning. We edit our friends. As people move through life, they become increasingly aware that time is somehow running out. More social contacts feel superficial, trivial, in contrast to the ever-deepening ties of existing close relationships. It becomes increasingly important to make the right choice, not to waste time on gradually diminishing future payoffs. So what happens at endings is a very positive thing. We get serious. We edit. We take out our existential red pencil, and we start scratching out anything that isn't important. Why? As we see over and over again, it has to do with the search for meaning. And what's so interesting about this is that you can manipulate this in the laboratory. You can manipulate this in the laboratory. You can also see it in other natural settings. So for instance, if you look at the social network of college students over their 4 years, or some people 6 years of college, right? You see the same kind of pattern. Social networks that widen, 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 widen. You look at people in their senior year, they do the same, and Carstensen has this research. They do the same thing. Something is ending. They scratch out the non-essential people. They edit their friends. What's interesting about this, as I said, is you can manipulate this in the laboratory. If you say to people, imagine if there's a medical breakthrough that allows you to live 30 years longer. They don't edit. They actually continue that rise. But there's something about being at the end that makes us edit. I think it's actually a very healthy instinct, but again, it shows how deep-seated this search for meaning is and how endings can accelerate it. Let's go to the last one. Endings help us elevate. Endings help us elevate, okay? So we've got endings help us edit, endings help us encode, endings help us energize, thank you. Endings help us energize. I better say that, I'll repeat it myself. Energize, encode, edit, and elevate. So here's, if I'm gonna leave you with, there's one practical tip that is a huge takeaway from this research. If nothing else, this will be helpful to you. It's been very helpful to me. And let me give you an example of this. How many of you have ever said this? I've got some good news and some bad news. I've got some good news and some bad news. Okay, now I looked at, I was trying to figure out, going onto the Google to say, okay, who's the source of this? And I realized the source was everybody, okay? Everybody has said this. Everybody has said this. I've said it myself many, many times. But here's the question. Which should you give first, the good news or the bad news? Now, let me tell you my practice, okay? What I've done all my life. I always give the good news first. Why? Because I don't want to be perceived as a jerk, because usually things are not so awful that they're irredeemable. And I sort of like to, maybe I'm also probably uncomfortable delivering bad news. I like to spread down that kind of downy duvet of good feeling before bringing down the hammer, right? That's my practice. But let me ask you a question here. Let me get out of my own head. Forget about your giving good news and bad news. Put yourself in the position of someone on the other side of the table. When someone says, I've got some good news and some bad news, and then they say, which would you like to hear first? Okay, how many of you would like to hear the good news first? How many of you would like to hear the bad news first? Exactly! Over and over again, that's what the research found. There's a great paper from the journal, from Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. 4 out of 5 people prefer to begin with a loss or negative outcome and ultimately end with a gain or positive outcome rather than the reverse. Receivers want the bad news first. They want the good news last. The problem is that many of us, not all of us, our instinct is to do the reverse. And what they find is that this suggests that doctors, teachers, partners do a poor job of giving good news and bad news because they forget for a moment how they want to hear it. All right, here is the principle at stake here. All right, this is number 4, endings elevate. This is a big deal here. Given a choice, human beings prefer endings that elevate. We prefer rising sequences to declining sequences. Rising sequences to declining sequences. This is a big deal as you actually begin shaping the when of your own life and your own work. Let me give you one example of this. It's a pretty interesting example. And I want to have, again, one of the great things about this conference and having talked to Raj for years and years is this kind of, you don't make that false separation between what is personal and what is professional. What is my life and what is my business? They're integrated in here, okay? And so I want to give you some things that, now, in some ways, the social science is not always as enlightened as that. But so I want to give you examples both in terms of people's general approach to navigating their lives, but also some business things as well. And what you'll see is that they all come together, as this last study indicates. So let's talk about Hershey's Kisses. This is a great study out of the University of Michigan. University of Michigan, here's what they did. They brought a bunch of students into the student center, and they set up a table. And what they were nominally doing, what they were saying they were doing was, we're going to have a taste test of some new varieties of Hershey's Kisses made from local ingredients. Okay, so it was a taste test. So once again, two groups of participants. Okay, this group of participants, it went like this. They would come to the table, and the experimenter, who didn't know what they were searching for, would do this. Here is your first Hershey's, here's your first candy. Please taste it and evaluate it on a 1 to 10 scale. Then they said, here is your next candy. 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 The people got a total of 5 candies. They didn't know how many they were going to get. These other people, very similar, except for one small change. Here's a candy. Please taste it and evaluate it on a 1 to 10 scale. Here is your next candy. Here is your next candy. Here is your next candy. Get ready. Here is your last candy. Okay? They didn't know how many they were getting at the outset, but they knew which one was last. So everybody gets 5 candies. They don't know how many they're getting at the outset. Does simply saying that this candy is your last one change people's evaluation of the candy? If it didn't, why would I be mentioning it, right? So let's... Stupid question, sorry about that. All right? But let's take a look at this. This is a pretty amazing chart here, all right? This is a pretty amazing chart. So here's candy 1. Okay, so these are the people who, so the gray bar is here is your next chocolate. The people who eventually said, here is your next chocolate, who always got here is your next chocolate, and this is the one who got here is your last chocolate at the end, okay? So this is a weird little difference. It's not statistically significant, okay? So there's not much difference here. Okay, second candy, not much difference. Third candy, not much, again, not statistically significant difference. Fourth candy, a little bit more of a difference. Fifth candy, take a look at this. For the people who said, here is your last candy, and here's your last chocolate, and here is your next chocolate. The people who knew it was the last chocolate loved it. They loved it more. They loved it twice as much as the people who just knew it was their next. They loved it. Wait, look at this daylight here. They loved it more than any candy they tasted. Why? Because you just called it the last one. Given a choice, human beings prefer endings that elevate. So this raises some interesting questions about what you can do to change the endings of customer service encounters, change the endings of employee evaluation, change the endings of almost anything. Human beings prefer endings that elevate. Let's talk about takeaways here. So that's the science of these 4 roles of endings. So here are some takeaways for you. 1, use endings to energize yourself and others, okay? You can create endings. If you're a runner, and many of you are, sometimes, I just did this the other day. I was running outside in Washington, D.C., where I live. It was very, very hot outside at about 5 in the afternoon. And I was really tired, and it was really hot, way too hot for October. And I kept doing things like this. Okay, I just want to get to the mailbox. And I got to the mailbox, and I would say, I just want to get to that traffic light on Macomb. Got to the traffic light on Macomb. You can impose endings as a form of energizing yourself and others. This is really important. Remember that how people behave and how situations unfold at the end deeply shape how we remember them. Deeply shape how we remember them. This is actually an argument in some ways for really nice going away parties for people at work, which I used to think was kind of a stupid thing. But now I think, oh, you know what? Actually, let's have a good ending here. So the person who's leaving remembers us fondly, and we remember her fondly. Number 3, when you get to the end of anything, don't be afraid to edit down to the essentials. I think in general, we don't edit enough in our lives, but endings force us to. Don't resist that. Number 4, always give the bad news first. Not a close call, folks. Always give the bad news first. And finally, number 5 is really the meta point here, which I think connects so nicely with what you're doing here in Conscious Capitalism, which is this. Use endings as meaning makers. Use endings as meaning makers. And there's so many opportunities to do this in business. As I said, school teachers do this incredibly well. At the end of a semester, there's one school teacher I interviewed who says, at the end of a semester, there's one school teacher, it's not a school teacher, a college teacher, takes her students out to dinner, and they all make toasts to each other. Okay? What a lovely way to sort of make a meaningful end to a semester. There's a high school teacher in Chicago who I interviewed who has his seniors write letters to themselves that he mails to them 5 years later. All right? So use endings as meaning makers. Use endings as meaning makers. Human beings want meaning. Okay? It's not touchy-feely. It's a very hard-headed conclusion from a rich array of social science, and endings can be ferocious meaning makers in your work and in your life. Okay? So let me wrap up on that. As I said, the book comes out January 9th. You can't read it yet, but as my elevated ending for you, we are going to send everybody in this room a free copy of the book on January 9th. Thanks.